Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. In February 2022, Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine. And just days later, the relatively newly minted German Chancellor Olaf Scholz held his historic Zeitenwende speech. In it, he said that things would not be the same as they were before Russia's attack, and he outlined some fundamental shifts in Germany's foreign, security, and energy policy. Now, almost 2 years later, the war in Ukraine drags on. New crises have arisen, such as the open conflict in Gaza and rising concerns over migration. And Chancellor Scholz and his Ampelkoalition are struggling in the polls. To talk about the Zeitenwende and today's complex security, geopolitical, and geoeconomic environment, I'm joined by Dr. Stefan Fröhlich. He is professor of international politics and political economy at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. Lieber Stefan, herzlich willkommen. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So Stefan, before we dive into our conversation, before we start making this a little bit more interactive, I'd like to ask you to sort of set the stage for us. I think it's fair to say that certainly within Germany, on both sides, within Europe, on this side of the Atlantic, there was a great deal of interest in the pledges that Chancellor Scholz made in his Zeitenwende speech. And, one place to start is whether or not Germany has delivered on those promises and how the global environment has evolved since February of 2022.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for having me. Actually, you, in a nutshell, already set the stage by, with your short introduction. I also promise to be short so that we have plenty of time for the discussion. Yes, let me first of all start with some general remarks. As you said, Stephen, no doubt this was an historical moment in various ways, because we had got used in not only here in this country, but also throughout Europe and in the US, that ever since the end of the Cold War, a reunified Germany has approached its role in Europe and also in the world based actually on three assumptions. Let me remind you of these three assumptions very briefly. First, security relied on critical dialogue and engagement, as we like to call it, rather than defense, and by relying on the US, on NATO, and our partners, European partners. Second, energy needs could be met by cheap Russian gas and oil. Thirdly, future prosperity rested with exports to an over-expanding Chinese market. These three key assumptions led and actually guided our foreign security policy and foreign economic policy for more than 20 years since the end of the Cold War. Let me add also that none of these choices were inevitable. Let me put it this way, as some of our partners, from time to time pointed out and reminded us of us. But the dangers of these policies were, I think, simply ignored. I remember also very well discussions we had back in 2013-14 on the Chancellor Office, in the State Department, Foreign Office here in Germany, where, of course, quite a few people, not many, not too many, were already sending out warning signals in terms of, particularly with regard to Nord Stream, what happened in Crimea, actually, and our huge dependence on Russian oil and gas. Now, then, 2022, you mentioned it, actually, the war started. And the Chancellor all of a sudden committed to bolstering investments in the nation's armed forces and the Bundeswehr, while also providing military support to Ukraine and imposing joint sanctions against Russia. Furthermore, Germany began reforms with regard to its energy policy, and it began to review its trade relationship rather cautiously, I would say, with autocratic regimes such as China. So in other words, the Chancellor, as you said, pledged that Germany would assume a more proactive stance, and not only in defending Europe, but also on the global stage. So where are we now after 2 years? I'm afraid the situation is not what it looked like when all of us were, really enthusiastic about the Chancellor's announcement of the special fund of the 100 billion he wanted to invest. We'll come back to that later during the discussion, into our army, into the defense, etc. What is the reason for that? I think the progress in recent months and over the last year, particularly 2023, the progress of these initiatives I just briefly mentioned, has encountered significant delays and faced obstacles. What is the reason for that? Germany is faced with reckoning with years of underinvestment in the armed forces and in inadequate structures and processes, which combined, I would say, with a shift in the political debate, as you just pointed out very briefly and touched upon, Stephen, present a significant challenge for the country. What do I mean with that? First of all, my greatest concern here, and I think not only my greatest concern, but also, also at least among some parliamentarians in political Berlin, is that in the end, Russia could be proven right. If you look at the current situation, that the West lacks in the end the long breaths, let me call it this way. We see what's going on, what the situation is not only in Germany, but throughout Europe, and also, of course, in the United States. That is something we need to worry about. The other issue is related to domestic politics. So it's a very similar situation to what you have in your country and what you have elsewhere in Europe. And I think we need to be concerned about that, because as in your country and in various EU member states, the German government struggles currently enormously, as you all know, with right-wing populism, with the AfD, with migration, with disputes over fiscal austerity. We saw it these days would be gone, but in the end, what we see right now, against the background of inflation, rising prices, etc., all of a sudden the FDP is starting, to relaunch the debate on fiscal austerity, debt breaks. You all followed that and heard about that, a principle designed to restrict structural deficits and safeguard the economy from overbearing debt. So then protests in the streets right now, the farmers only recently. And then last not least, all that ends up in political gridlocks due to a quarreled coalition. Look at the situation. Look at the state elections coming up, the situation there in Eastern Germany, actually, where the AfD has become the strongest party, actually. So we don't see any, really plausible and reliable, also and maybe sustainable coalition scenarios and options, not only on the federal level, but also on the state level. And that is really something that attracts and distracts our attention, which we actually need for Ukraine, for what's going on in the Middle East, for the most pressing foreign policy crisis and challenges, and makes us, being almost completely engaged in domestic issues and how can we, overcome all these domestic obstacles right now. That is, I think, a real concern. And on top of it, of course, nobody seems to be prepared. That's my fear for second term, maybe with Trump. Let me put that to say that very bluntly. That could very likely weaken the continental security alliance with the United States, Bruce Stokes just wrote a very interesting article. I don't know whether you've seen that actually about that. And he called it, Europe needs to Trump-proof its relation. And I fully agree with what he said actually in this piece. So that's a background. What is at stake? 3 issues. Which we can discuss maybe in the following minutes. The first is, of course, the still ongoing geostrategic challenge, the gaps in military capabilities. The Bundeswehr faces severe deficiencies in equipment. We're all familiar with that. And its operational capabilities are in dire need of modernization. The country's military stocks have reached alarmingly low levels. So Germany could only sustain, let me be very frank with you, combat operations for a few days, well below NATO standards of 30 days. Problems are rooted in complicated public procurement requirements, administrative burdens. We know that. We're familiar with that. We have been familiar with that for many years. And reliance on outdated, highly vulnerable technologies. And the still existing discomfort, I have to, unfortunately, to add that, as we've seen after also, an overwhelming support for the Ukraine and for support of the Ukraine, it's hardly vanishing. It's still there. Still, the majority of the people are supportive of that, but it's waning actually, and we should not. It's similar to what it is in other countries throughout Europe. And here, that brings me back to the concern I just mentioned. Will Putin be proven right, actually, in the end, that we do not have the long wrist for all that, which we definitely need in this situation. So that is one issue. We can discuss it. The second issue I'd like to stress and is that next to the geostrategic challenge, the security challenges, I think we should not underestimate the geoeconomic challenge, what I call the geoeconomic challenge. I told you, Stephen, I'm just working on a book. Yeah. I just finished a book on this geoeconomic Zeitenwende, which I think is probably even the greater challenge to not only to Germany but to Europe. This may sound very provocative, but nevertheless, I mean, the war in Ukraine, I nevertheless think is a rather single event. It can happen again. Things like that can happen again, but that's certainly, fortunately, luckily not the rule. Now we have another war in the Middle East, an ongoing conflict which erupted again. But basically, I think as long as we fulfill the necessary tasks in terms of, deterrence, defense, forward defense on the eastern flank, and as long as we deliver, particularly Europeans deliver, I think we have a good chance actually to get through that. But the geoeconomic challenge is, I think, maybe a generational problem and challenge to Germany, because this means actually that we have to give up very much let me put it bluntly, our business model. Germany needs to rethink the relationship between security and economic interests. For decades, German foreign policy has been strongly driven by the latter. And this serves Germany's economic growth for as long as the geopolitical environment, of course, remained favorable. And there were no major challenges to the US-led international order. That has changed dramatically. So that's another thing we can discuss right away, of course. I think that is one of the most pressing challenges, and where there are already some signs that we at least have begun to struggle with the question of how to assess and manage the security risks caused by economic dependencies. Dependence on Russian fossil fuels has been drastically and successfully reduced, but economic ties to China remain extensive and are more complex than the connections to Russia ever were. Last but not least, my last point here is the cultural challenge. I call it the mental challenge. I think all this, the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle still is for all that, or these necessary, let me put it this way, these necessary strategic changes, which we really need to undertake, cannot take place without a strong and sustained support from the German population. At the cultural level, a successful Zeitenwende will require a deeper evolution of the way German electors conceive the role of Germany in Europe and the world, and approach the question of its military action. And that is something our politicians have to communicate, and that is still lacking. And for the various reasons I just try to explain. So that's basically, that is what is at stake. What do we need now, and what do we have to do? I think we should leave that for the discussion, and maybe take first of all some question, and then go deeper into all these issues and aspects. I start.
Stefan, thank you so much for weaving together a number of foreign policy issues, but also domestic policy issues. And I definitely want us both to think about coming back to this question of what's the path forward before we wrap up our conversation. But many of the things that you said, I think, are so rich and worth commenting on. I'd like to thank you for providing this great start for our conversation, and for beginning by reminding us about those three assumptions that have really driven a lot of Germany's post-Cold War policy since the 1990s. I'd maybe like to start with one issue that you raised about military preparedness, and the notion of the 100 billion that were earmarked for building up the Bundeswehr. This was in the Zeitenwende speech, and in practice, in addition to commitments to Ukraine and defense spending on Ukraine, but also in addition to meeting the 2% of defense spending sort of requirement laid out by NATO, or through an agreement of the NATO member states. Where do things stand with the spending and allocation of that 100 billion? I've heard a number of different things. One is that the 100 billion that was earmarked 2 years ago is worth less today because of inflation and just inflationary trends. Another thing has been that it was, and this is something that a senior representative from the Defense Ministry said, it's not as if you could go out and buy the things that you needed off the shelf at the time, that the procurement process takes some time. But I received assurances that by the end of last year, by the end of 2023, something like 80% of that 100 billion was earmarked for specific projects and defense spending. What have your observations been on the 100 billion?
Steve, you actually got the point already. It's one thing is for sure. Let me be very clear on that. This special defense fund of 100 billion, actually announced in February 2022, enabled Germany to reach NATO's defense spending target of 2% of GDP, but only for a couple of years. It will run out. We will face the same problems in 2025 as we did before. So there is no longer-term commitment so far. And this is exactly what Pistorius is struggling with, actually. He's well aware of that. That means, and there also, by the way, Germany's military aid to Ukraine during the first year of the full-scale war was substantial, but the decisions were often, on the other hand, we all know, and this is pointing to the direction of the second aspect related to your question, the procurement actually and the implementation. I think the biggest problem here is also that decisions were very often slow to come. take the issue of the Leopard tanks, actually, which particularly created a negative publicity and almost a frustration among elites, because what was Scholz's strategy? He actually was still always waiting, following the wait-and-see policy. What does the US do? And if they go ahead, actually, if they march ahead, we might follow. This is the wrong signal, sending out the wrong signals also to the European partners. So, as I said, and as you said, I'm afraid this $100 billion and euros, and no matter whether you take into account, let's say, the development of the inflation, it is not enough. We will have a problem within the next 2 years, and once again be where we were before if we do not step up. We need at least, we have to fill a gap of like 15 billions, according to most experts, military experts, if it comes to the defense budget by 2025. Once again, roughly. And that means, yes, this still remains, I think, our number one task. And this goes not only for Germany, by the way, Europe in general. And that brings me also back to exactly the question: what happens if the US really, if in the end they would not deliver and would say, you take care of all that. Prompted by Trump, if he would, let's say in worst case scenario, be re-elected, threats while in office, leaves much to be desired as well. So the commitments, not only by Germany, but Europe in general, most NATO countries are still spending less than 2% of GDP on defense. And 20 out of the 28 European NATO members currently spend more on personnel than on major equipment, maintenance, research and development, operations, and infrastructure. So this does not solve our problem. We definitely need to deliver at that point and deliver more and send out the right signal. And I think in these days it's more urgent than ever, because if the bloc want to succeed in helping Ukraine and safeguarding against, let's say insecurity in your country, maybe U.S. unreliability, whatever you want to call it, in the future, it should embrace Washington's new proposal I think this is another point. I'm now a little bit going over here, beyond your question. We should seize, for instance, Russian assets. We should do more. We need to do something. We need the money to help Ukraine. The impasse over Ukraine funding due to Hungary's veto also highlights a troubling structural flaw in EU decision making. We are in a really complicated situation right now, and one that is destined to really cause us trouble in 2024. This might be a very decisive year.
So I think this year will be a decisive year, no matter what, given the election in the US, but also the European parliamentary elections and elections around the world, right? There's a lot on the line, a lot at stake. Since you were just talking about seizing Russian assets, something I was planning to ask you a little later, but it fits in here, is the sanctions regime. I mean, you were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that Germany has stepped up and been involved and engaged with sanctions against Russia. A number of people I've spoken with recently have called into question whether the sanctions are having the desired effect, and that Russia seems to be getting by despite the sanctions. What's your take on the sanctions regime?
My take is really difficult to see. What sense do any sanctions make as long as you circumvene them and escape from that? And this is exactly what Russia is practicing and doing. There are too many out in this world actually still helping, still supporting, of course, Putin. And by the way, I don't know whether you heard that just 2 days ago, a Ukrainian officer telling and suggesting that he was looking at, these some of the military equipments, based and composed of various, still European Americans components and things like that. We do still actually, deliver the things. He still gets what he needs. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. That's the biggest concern. So it's not only a question to what extent they can be effective. The other thing is, I from my perspective, I think the biggest problem is the Ukraine does not have the time. And I think Russia has at least enough capacity actually to carry on as it does actually, and continue this war for quite a number of years actually. Mm-hmm. In the end. And that is actually what should be our concern. So, because they prepared themselves for all this, actually. They have accumulated huge currency reserves, have repatriated them before the war. So they prepared for this war. So for that reason, I'm not so optimistic with regard to. I'm 100% sure that the sanctions do harm, and that this war does harm the economy, and in the medium and long-term perspective, Russia will suffer. But this is not what we need right now. This doesn't help us right now. It doesn't help the Ukrainians right now. That is the point. And we should stop arguing, that maybe in the medium or long run, this is exactly what we're doing here. This will play out and will help actually, and will bring Putin down. No, this can go on for another couple of years. And that's a problem. And that's when this time we do not have.
Yeah, it can really be that Russia is waging a war of attrition and can just drag this out. And
it's doing it. It's already doing it. It's already doing it. Actually, this is the latest phase of this war. Yeah. And after all our optimism that that Ukraine actually could actually even prevail, I think the latest developments over the winter, over the last couple of months, actually have shown that Putin is in the upper hand right now. Yeah. That's a problem, and against all this, the background I just try to describe in the political situation, the stalemates in our countries, and the political debates actually would keep them doing what we need to, from doing what we need to do. This is my greatest concern.
And I definitely want to come back to some of these domestic concerns and how this is playing out domestically as well. While we're talking about defense, one of our viewers rightly points out that in 2023, the German government released a national security strategy. This was one of 3 big strategies that were released in 2023. And our viewer writes that the national security strategy did not even mention Bundeswehr recruitment or training as components of national security. In a subsequent meeting here in New York with a state secretary from the defense ministry, we were assured that these issues are being addressed separately and that the Bundeswehr is putting together its own defense strategy. But to what degree is this the case? What have you heard about an emphasis on recruitment and training?
You just have to read the document. If you see the document, what's at least what we so far have seen, actually, I have to admit there's not much you find about this issue. Yeah, and this is astonishing. Of course, what could I can't add anything to that. Actually, this is exactly what we and one of the flaws of this national security strategy, this latest one actually, and it's not enough. And exactly this is exactly the point. If you raise that issue, if you discuss that with representatives also from the Defense Department, they're exactly pointing out this is part of the implementation. Pointing out that these kind of strategies, by the way, similar. That's what you tell and what you say about almost all national security strategies, even in the United States, they are not reliable in terms of, that there are any guide for operational and implement steps and implementation steps. We have to admit that. But again, at least the debate on that, even before we actually launched the NSS, was missing in my view, as far as I could follow it actually, and from the discussion. So I can only agree with that.
So I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about energy, because that ties into some of the geopolitics and geoeconomics as well. I think many people were impressed with the speed with which Germany weaned itself off of Russian energy in 2022, basically in the space of 9 months. It went to zero, partly also because Russia turned the taps off. But Germany also built very quickly 3 LNG terminals. And I guess I wonder if you believe that this is also a stopgap, like the 100 billion investment in the Bundeswehr, and that this problem is not being adequately addressed. But I'd also like to get your thoughts on whether Germany is almost switching its dependencies, given the fact that it's moving away from a dependence on Russia, but starting to consume energy from places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Yes, we're doing that, and it was actually astonishing how quickly this decision came, because frankly speaking, we have no other choice. Even if it comes at a high price, because it came at a high price, as we all know. Look at the soaring prices, energy prices in Germany, way higher than in any other European country, higher than in your country, as you all know, for various reasons. That has also something to do, of course, with our, let me be frank, actually, not very, very smart, I would actually even say, energy policy of the last 10 years or 15 years, frankly speaking. But this is the price we're paying. So it came pretty fast, as a matter of fact. And it proved that there are ways actually to diversify also the suppliers. So we did that fastly with the support, of course, not only of Qatar, the US as well, by the way, and various other, Norway and so forth. So we were lucky actually to quickly adapt to the situation, rather quickly, comparatively quickly. The same pace I'm missing actually with regard to China. Of course, this is way more complex, way more complicated, but definitely what we've seen as is something. And here I wouldn't say that Germany is, leading, let's say, this discussion. I would love to see Germany becoming even more assertive with regard to the fact that the EU, meanwhile, under von der Leyen, has begun to ramp up its economic defense capabilities. Although policy differences, of course, persist between the member states. But we've done quite a lot on the European level, on the European scale, in terms of, you probably heard about the idea, instead of decoupling, de-risking, the idea of von der Leyen's de-risking strategy, diversifying the suppliers, actually. So there are so many initiatives I could actually here enumerate and mention in that context, that show that I think there's a particular awareness in Brussels, and Germany is incrementally and rather slowly, I would say, following that course. For various reasons. We all know that, of course, that Germany is way more dependent on China than many other member states, than the average EU member state. That's one of the problems. Our big industries, I don't have to tell you, are heavily dependent. But here again, you could see something I also pointed out in my book on the geoeconomic Zeitenwende. There's only one way to cope with that situation, and that is strengthening Europe, because there is this is not a one-way street, the dependence on China. There's mutual dependencies. There are mutual dependencies. If you look at it on the EU level, now Germany alone is certainly an important trade partner for the United for China, but way more important is Europe as an entity, and that's why it's so important. Actually, if you just think of that, the fact that Germany is trading, more than 50% of our exports go to the EU, so the common market. Only 5 to 6 go to China. The problem is that these are basically the big industries, actually, the automobile sector and so forth, that are, have not only an enormous lobby, but of course are important actors and players in that field. And but by and large, if you put that into perspective and look at the European level, the European Union is actually the leverage. Is our leverage to deal with China. And the other one is, we can maybe discuss that. I think this will also come maybe in our discussion, is of course, how do we deal with the US, and to what extent do we follow US-led alliance vis-a-vis, I wouldn't say against, but vis-a-vis China.
So let's stick with China for just a minute, because obviously you've talked a little bit about Germany's new national security strategy. On the heels of that, the German government released a China strategy, and you had talked a little bit about the fact that the complexity of the relationship between Germany and China is even greater than the complexity of the relationship between China and Russia. And that Berlin is very much rethinking its security and economic interests, and is seeking diversification and de-risking, but not decoupling when it comes to China. And I guess I'd be actually not I, but one of our viewers is very curious about your take on the China strategy and whether it goes far enough. And I think if I can add to that, we're hearing different things between what we hear from government representatives and what we hear from business leaders when it comes to the relationship with China. And you talked a little bit about the economic dependence before.
Yes, very, very important point. I think Germany still is very reluctant and struggles with the idea that is, of course, basically, of course, predominantly launched by the US. Let me put it this way, as I just said, to join a US-led bloc, we are reluctant of. This is typically Germany. I mean, we were talking about these illusions of the past, and I think we're still struggling with the idea that we have to become way more serious with and way more concerned with what is going on in China, because China has completely reversed its strategy and its economic policy, as you all know, which so far was for more than 20 years export driven, and meanwhile, of course, is stepping up into the next level of what I would call the modernization process with the economy, and that is based on consumption and high investment in technologies to become more actually self-sufficient to a certain degree. And with that actually comes Xi Jinping's return to, I would say, even a more stylist policy of control over businesses. So enterprises, even private enterprises, meanwhile, are somehow infiltrated, let me put it this way, very bluntly, by cadres from the Communist Party. You wouldn't believe it. So that's what's happening right now. This has to be a concern to us. Not to mention, of course, that China has been violating the WTO rules and spirit over the last 15, 20 years in a very blunt way. So we could, of course, always say, coming to this geoeconomic power struggle also between the US and the EU on the one hand and China, that we are also, to a certain extent, of course, sinners. So we also somehow have become protectionists in various ways. And in your countries, it started not with Trump, it started with Obama already, as a reaction to China's behavior, as a matter of fact. But way more, what you should add, actually, if you look at the openness of the economies, China's economy is 4 to 5 times less open than still the average European economy and also the US economy. And that's what we have to cope with. So we should stop this. I think this is very important. This reluctance to join anything what we call a US-led bloc vis-a-vis China. It should not be about decoupling. I think even in your country, meanwhile, everybody, the political elites are well aware decoupling is not an option.
But I think we're beyond that at this point in the US as well. Exactly. There might be some people who talk about decoupling.
I know that.
We're moving much further in the direction of diversification as you are. And I think, based on everything that you've described, I'm actually hearing arguments for why Europe and the United States should be working closer and closer with each other, that there should be a Schulterschluss, right? A standing together vis-a-vis China. I think in many senses, people are now regretting that TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Program, did not go into effect when it could have, because we would have had a more robust and stable infrastructure in place.
Well, I fully agree, and that's what I'm arguing for also here in this country. I think we do not have a choice. Or let me put it this way: at least what used to be Merkel's doctrine, which I would call, and some other colleagues also called, a policy of equidistance between China and the US, that belongs to the past. There's no way, actually, at that point. This does not mean, again, equidistance or giving up equidistance does not mean decoupling. It means de-risking. It means clearly point out where China violates certain principles and where we do need to address these challenges by becoming maybe ourselves more assertive, as I indicated. And that's exactly what the EU is at least trying to do. If you look at all these new instruments, trade defense instruments, the Investment Screening Act, the new procurement initiative of the EU, or the anti-coercion initiative, these are pointing to the right direction. And we have to follow this path. And Germany has to learn this lesson.
Maybe one more question on China before we move on comes from one of our viewers, who points out that there is bipartisan agreement in the US that one of the things that China has been engaged in that we must push back on is technology transfer and international property theft. And the viewer is curious whether this is a concern that is shared by the private sector in Germany, but also by the political elites in Germany.
Yes. Meanwhile, yes. It took quite a while, actually, but meanwhile, yes, I'm absolutely sure about that. So we've realized that this is an issue, and I think everything what surrounded the discussion about the European Chips Act clearly points out and is pointing into that direction. That not only we are running, or we have run into dependency similar to what the situation is in case of Russia, and with regard to chips, to these chips and semiconductors and so forth, critical materials and raw materials and resources. So this is one aspect, and that goes also, of course, for the the technology aspect and the intellectual theft. There's no doubt about it that this is an issue, and I think meanwhile Germany, I definitely, according, by the way, to polls among business, not only the big business, also medium-sized, small. There is a much larger, you wouldn't believe that, much larger awareness of all this among, let's say, the political elites. And it's interesting to see that while we were when we started the discussion, the political debate to de-risk China, to de-risk and to more sort of, our businesses had already started long before the pandemic, by the way, to decrease their business, actually, to possibly withdraw from China and do less business with China, except for some of the still, let's say the big champions, so the hidden champions, the so-called hidden champions, have been doing that for quite a while already, and they're pointing out to that. So it's something. I think there is an awareness here, and meanwhile, and this is quite promising, as a matter of fact.
Stefan, I'd like to come back to Russia for just a moment with two questions from viewers, and then we'll continue on. One of our viewers, and I'm paraphrasing here, said that there was a recent intelligence report out of Estonia that if there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, Russia would be able to rebuild its forces within 3 to 6 years and could launch an attack against the Baltics. Our viewer is curious what the reaction has been among German politicians, and whether German politicians are concerned about a possible Russian attack against a NATO member state.
That is a question. That is the question. As a matter of fact, first of all, let me maybe start with by saying, because I think it's quite telling. It tells a lot about, of course, still the great fear among the political elites to not become, as we all know, enter the war, become a war member. You all know that, and we have the same debate actually almost everywhere. But I think particularly here we can see again from the current discussion about the so-called Tauros. You've heard of that. Is the debate, when do we deliver? Scholz in October last year indicated we might or we should deliver, and again then he became like we stopped it. Actually, nobody at that. There are some pushing for that, and I also believe that it would be extremely helpful for Ukrainians. It will not actually completely change the war or end the war immediately. But it would certainly help the Ukraine, and I think this is once again a clear signal where you can see this kind of reluctance, the idea that we might, with that, because of the fact that with these missiles we could actually hit civilian targets. We could actually hit Russian soil, or Ukrainians could hit Russian soil. This would make us a war member, actually, an active. I fully disagree with that interpretation, and I said that from the very beginning here in this country, because you could see the discussions throughout the last 2 years. It was always the same. If we deliver that, we become a war member. If we do that and that, and it never happened, actually. Which to me indicates that as long as we are clearly committed, the old principle of deterrence somehow works. Russia does not want to provoke this kind of war. It would maybe be tempted to do so if we actually start to, weaken our support for Ukraine, our stance, etc. Then this is actually really this is an inherent danger, actually, potentially. It's a risk. So for that reason, I do not think that Russia at that point is really I think also it's not capable to launch such an attack right now. Let's say to reach out towards NATO territory, because it is actually in a pretty bad situation. It can, of course, produce tanks. It can produce artillery. It is manpower. But look at how far or to what extent Russia has it been successful? No, it now owns 18% of the territory of Ukraine, and the goal was actually conquering Ukraine. I don't see anything like, a potential danger that Russia might actually take another step to really threaten NATO territory.
I mean, perhaps another scenario that comes in there, and sticking with this notion of deterrence, one of our viewers is curious to hear your thoughts about news that NATO is preparing for a joint military exercise that might serve as some sort of deterrence to Russia, and how Putin might present this publicly, whether he would see it as an act of aggression that could actually serve as a catalyst for something even greater.
Yes, maybe again coming back to the first part of that question. I'm not saying that Russia wouldn't be capable to do so. Let's say, as one of the in the audience suggested that the question before was asking, is that the Baltic, for instance, could that be a threat actually to the at the point, maybe in a couple of years, right now not, but in a couple of years, let's say in 3, 4, 5 years, yes. Because the numbers, I think it will, from what most military experts tell us, is actually it will take Russia to rebuild its destroyed military, to retool its defense industry and catch up, let's say, back up on ammunition, 3 to 4, 5 years in the current situation. These are the things that they would need to fight, actually, of course, against NATO. At the current situation, it cannot fight against NATO. I would say, but of course, in a couple of years, things could look different. It's really difficult to say, and figures and from military experts vary. I think even a couple of weeks ago, I saw an interview with General Ben Hodges. He exactly said that. I mean, it will take 3 to 8 years, maybe, he said, for Russia to do that and to be in this situation. But again, I think the most important thing here is, before we start worrying about this, is typical also the typical German debate. We're worried, concerned about what could happen, let's say, whether it could reach NATO territory. The more we are reluctant at that point, the more likely it becomes actually that Russia is at one point, reaching, and taking this step and taking the risk. That is a problem. So I think these are the wrong discussions at that point. We need to deter Russia right now to make clear we do not will never let Ukraine fall in this situation. And that is my number one concern. I think that's the only language he would understand at that stage, at that point.
And one has to continue with that drumbeat and repeat that over and over again. I'm looking at the clock and see that we have about 5 minutes left. Since we started a little late, maybe we can go over a little bit, but I'd like to come back to some of the domestic concerns that you talked about and how those are playing out. You talked about the fact that there are tensions locally. You mentioned the strike or the protests and demonstrations by the farmers. There's a lot of unease in Germany right now. One of our viewers is curious, given the increase in defense spending and military spending that's on the table, doesn't this risk trying to address some of these local concerns and funding for programs at home. How is Germany able to do both things, particularly given the debt brake and having a balanced budget?
Yes, that's a good question, and that's a key question right now. But there is no doubt that this has an impact on the necessary foreign policy decisions and investments, also in defense at that point. The problem is, of course, that the current political debate and then the recent cases, by the way, that's also very interesting, of right-wing extremism and seditious plots within the armed forces that happen also in the country, and also the rise of the AfD have fed mistrust and skepticism, of course, in many ways, we also faced only recently, and that's also something that concerns me and worries me, large-scale demonstrations in, for instance, in central Berlin, opposing the provision of more weapons to Ukraine. That we didn't have that before, and that highlights the significant portion of the population that remains opposed to a certain degree, of course, to the country's new defense policy and Scholz's commitment. I think it's even now it still remains difficult to change this defense culture to a significant degree, or the degree we would need to make all that happen. What we need, and that's why I'm frankly speaking, I'm not that optimistic. I'm only optimistic as long as so that is why it's so crucial that we somehow not only stick and stay together, but while we need our politicians to do way more than this coalition government currently does, in terms of convincing the public and the people what we need to do, what are necessary investments for the security, not only of Europe or the Ukraine, but also for our country. And that's what we unfortunately still do miss. And this is exactly what, of course, drives a man like our chancellor all the time to be so reluctant in the decision-making process and the necessary decisions. As a matter of fact, and the Leopard 2 tank decision was to Ukraine was another clear pointing into that in that direction when he conditioned the contribution, as I said, to the participation of others.
So widening our focus just a little bit, you've spoken extensively about the scope of geopolitical challenges that are facing Germany, but also Europe and the transatlantic community writ large. It's not just US elections on the horizon. This summer, there will be European parliamentary elections. And one of our viewers is curious what impact sort of this uncertain environment, this geopolitical landscape might have on elections for the European Parliament.
That's a good question. As a matter of fact, I told you, that's why I mentioned it in the very beginning. The domestic situation is what worries me most in these days, and because I think we're in that's why I was saying, and I will repeat it here. It's very much what you face right now. Terms of the debates, the polarization of the society, and particularly the party landscape, and that will affect also the European Parliament and the European Parliament parliamentary elections, and there is no doubt about it. And I'm pretty sure, and I think it will not change. It will not change, or we will not, we will not see that, let's say, we have these state elections, in upcoming state elections in Germany in the second half of the year, and some say, optimists still say, yeah, by that time actually we'll forge a strong coalition against, and the other parties will recover from the AfD. Once we now start a serious debate on the AfD and come to grips with what is really necessary, what are the necessary steps to address the concerns, the legitimate concerns of many people, be it migration, be it energy, etc. That is a dilemma in our situation. It doesn't make any difference. It is not helpful, let me put it this way, to debate and discuss this issue by purely referring to the AfD as a new Nazis or whatsoever. This does not help. That does not solve the problem, and that's where we are. And I think we will, unfortunately, if we won't become more decisive on these issues, more outspoken, our governments. Then I think we might also face a not so bright outcome in the European elections, to be frank.
So Stefan, you might think this is unfair as we bump up on the end of our conversation, but several viewers have written in with questions about the situation in Gaza and the conflict there. And I know that this is opening up a whole new topic, and we're really almost out of time, but they would be very curious to know what the current state of discussion in Germany is regarding the conflict in Israel/in Gaza, given the long-term support of Germany for the state of Israel, but also given the grassroots support for the Palestinian people. And so how does Germany sort of balance these interests, but also how does it deal with protests from pro-Palestinian groups and concerns over rising anti-Semitism in Germany?
That's a very good question, of course, and believe me, that's something that is really I'm thinking a lot about, and have been thinking a lot about in recent months since the war was launched. I was supposed to be in Israel, in Jerusalem, when the attacks came, and this terrorist attack came, this terrible act. So I had to cancel, of course, everything, teaching at Hebrew University. So, but what I can tell you here is, to be short, I mean, this is really another big issue, of course, here. But what is interesting, look into the mirror. I think we have a very similar situation here again in our country compared to what the situation is in your country. What do I mean by that is I see that we have an overwhelming support, sympathy, and despite all the cautiousness, to be balanced in our comments on this war. And probably you may have heard the speech of Habeck, who was the one politician, according to the public here, who tried to address and give a quite balanced answer to see the context of both sides and to compromise. I wouldn't say to compromise them, but to contextualize it. What I see here, apart from that, is a very clear and obvious support among the political elites for Israel. But I see just the other way, the opposite among the public. So we have an extremely polarized debate here and discussion, and polarized society also in that context about this war. Much and great sympathy, similar to what it is in your country, also among, by the way, the young people, university students. I can see that from the debates with my students. Very, very similar. So on the side of the political elites, yes, a clear commitment. As we all know, similar to what it is in your country, how did Merkel call it? Israel is Staatsräson. It's Staatsräson. Okay, whatever that means. I don't go into that.
That's a whole other discussion.
would be another topic, a very interesting, fascinating topic, but maybe not that. But same with the US.
Yeah.
But the situation among the people, the public, is different. So we have a very, very tense and polarized debate over the issue in the country right now.
Well, Stefan, herzlichen Dank. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking and wide-ranging conversation. I think that it's been fascinating to weave together the domestic and foreign policy concerns and challenges that exist at this time. I think, this has been a great Bestandsaufnahme, right? A great assessment of where we are right now. But unfortunately, we didn't get to the outlook, to the policy recommendations. There were a few things where you said this is something we need to do, but it's a question of how do we win the hearts and minds of the public to get support for the kinds of initiatives that are needed. And if you're open to it, I'd love to talk to you offline about coming back relatively soon so that we can focus more on what are those policy recommendations and what's the path forward.
Promise to do so. Wonderful.
Okay, super. Definitely. We will set another date. But for now, once again, many, many thanks. Thanks also to our viewers for tuning in and for all of those great questions. And stay tuned for another event with Stefan Fröhlich in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much.
Take care, Stefan. Vielen Dank.
Bye-bye.